Today I'm going to look at how allele frequencies change in the human population. I find this to be one of the more interesting chapters that we talk about when you look at all the different varieties of humans out there. But considering this, there's far many more humans on this planet than there are chimpanzees. But if we take any two chimpanzees and any two random humans, we will find there are far more differences between the chimpanzees than there are humans. We really don't have a lot of differences. All right, I'm not sure I can get through this in 15 minutes. It may be in 2 episodes. Anyway, the things that change allele frequencies are the things that we go against Hardy-Weinberg. So Hardy-Weinberg kind of comes up here as well. So we're going to look at how non-random mating changes things, migration, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. All right, so in terms of non-random mating, this indicates that individuals of one genotype reproduce more often with each other. Sometimes it's to do with ethnic or religious preferences. Sometimes you're an isolated community, only so many people you can go out with. There are some cultures, quite a few actually, that still allow marriage between relatives, usually first cousins or so, but it is fairly common still in most of the world. So if we look at the Lucky Charms graph we see here, starting down here, if everybody starts out with equal numbers, but the blue triangles mate more often, then you're going to end up with more blue triangles up here. Some examples. Arnold is an interesting individual. He was a Chinese immigrant to South Africa. He had this rare dominant mutation that caused all of his teeth to fall out before age 20. But South Africa allows for polygamy, so he decided to take advantage of that, and he had many wives and had many children. He actually had 7 wives and ended up with 356 living descendants. 70 of them have this weird dental disorder. Another example is Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan controlled most of Asia, almost to Europe. He had lots of wives and had lots of concubines, and as such, apparently paid a lot of attention to them. He had a lot of children. He basically outlived his children, and it was his grandchildren that actually inherited his throne. And there was so many grandchildren. When they got together, they basically created the largest city in Mongolia. Anyway, today, if we look at the people living between Afghanistan and northeast China, 1 out of every 200 males share his Y chromosome, which ends up being a lot of people. So when somebody says, hey, I'm a descendant of Genghis Khan, well, you say, well, who isn't? Because roughly 16 million people are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. Albinism is very common among the Hopi Indians. Tay-Sachs is common among the Ashkenazi Jews. This is due to with the Ashkenazi Jews, they only marry other Ashkenazi Jews, so that it's a small gene pool they're working with. With albino, basically the Indians would work out in the fields. If they did that, the people with albinism would have massively bad sunburn, so they would stay home with the women and work in the village. So they were actually home with the women a lot more than the people out in the fields. So there's a lot more albinos among the Hopi Indians. And of course, any population that shares that marries relatives or marry within a community have non-random mating go on. It's said that 70% of the world's population marries somebody born 10 miles from where they were born. So genes don't travel too far usually. All right, migration. Of course, if you're moving from one place to another, you're taking your genes from one place to another. And basically, the effects of migration are reflected in the current populations we see today when we look across the globe in terms of geography or even linguistic regions. Um, there's still a huge German influence in Cincinnati, and you can see that with our A blood. A blood's not that common except among Germans and people of Cincinnati. All right, and looking at our Lucky Charms graph, if you've got the yellow squares and red circles moving from one place to another, you are going to end up with more of those in the new population. And we can even trace uh, genes geographically and see how migrations move by tracing genes. So a common one is galactokinase deficiency. If you notice, in Switzerland, it's pretty rare, 1 out of 2.2 million. Germany, it's much more common, 1 out of 157,000. Austria, it's even more common, 1 out of 43. And then Bulgaria, 1 out of 52,000, all of which are the Gypsies, which came from the Vlax Roma region, so it's 1 out of 1,600. So it's actually following the Gypsy migrations is how it works. We're watching galactokinase move. Huge mountain range here. That's why they didn't get into Switzerland. Other things that can reflect historical events, we definitely see that with ABO blood types. Most of the world is O blood type, but we do see populations of A in Germany, and wherever Germans seem to have moved, you find that A blood as well. Mitochondrial DNA, we can see how it changes along the River Nile, so we can kind of see how the populations migrated and where they came from. Dialect, by looking at what language you speak, there's often a genetic trace there. So when you look at the Cajun talk of New Orleans and stuff, there's some German, some Indian, Spanish, they're all kind of mixed in there. So that's showing where their ethnic roots actually developed from. So genetic drift. So basically, there's something that causes a small population to separate from a larger group. And due to generally these are families that are moving, but there's other reasons that can create this. Basically, that you're getting a random sampling error. You're not just getting a random group of genes. You're getting a number, and that's what's brought in and then becomes more pronounced. It's a small population building up. So there are events that can create these small populations. There's what's known as founding a new population, often known as founder syndrome. So you got a small population that find a new place to live, and they're interbreeding because you only got a small population to breed with, and then they increase in number, and they have a lot of the same genes, and they have a lot of the same genetic disorders as well. Bottlenecks is basically an issue where the population was big and then something killed them off, and then it grew big again and got killed off. Something like that can happen. So we see that with a lot of animal groups. We also see it with humans. Jewish people have suffered a lot of bottlenecks in the history of the world when, just Nazis, it's just one tip of the iceberg of where the Jews have been persecuted and population brought down. They have a lot of genetic disorders associated with that. We see it with the cheetahs. Geographic separation. So if you go one group moves to one island, one group to another island, you've got basically separate founder syndromes going on. And sometimes culture can separate things. The Middle East is a classic example. You have the Jewish people developed there. Some of the pagan people came in, and they basically kept themselves separate for the most part. And then about 2,000 years ago, the Christian cult came in, and they separated from the Jewish group. They culturally moved in directions genetically. And then eventually the Muslim population, same sort of thing as well. All right, so if we look at different groups, we can see how they they have similar looks. When you look at these people, you can say, okay, this is a typical Icelandic trait, this is a typical Japanese trait. So if we look at how the founder syndrome affected that and how they look today, in Japan, that's a classic example. You only had 1,000 people from Asia come over to the island. Over the 80 to 100 generations later, there are now 120 million people, which is why the Japanese have certain looks that they were associated with being Japanese. Quebec started with 2,500. There are now 6 million today. Often they're the French group there, where the rest of Canada is from a different ethnic group for the most part. Sardinia, 500 people are now 1.6 million. So you can see how small population moving in can create a new population today, and whatever genes they brought in will then be there. So among the French Canadians in Quebec, we see an increase in the breast cancer gene. So that's one of the things we see there. The German population I mentioned is the blood typing groups. Among the A blood, of course, is much higher among the German Dunker population and Germans in general. You only see it about 40% in the US, 45% in the rest of Europe, but it's 60%. Now, if you go to Cincinnati, which is highly German, or Germantown, Pennsylvania for that matter, it's about 60% there as well. All right. Keep in mind that when you have genetic drift, non-random mating works with it as well. So, you're only going to have a small population. You only have so many people that you can have children with. That's going to create increase of the recessive phenotypes in a population. So religious stuff, we see that quite a bit. The Amish and Mennonites only marry predominantly with their own religious group. So they maintain this very small genetic pool. So we see a lot of recessive disorders that occur because of that. And we see that among the Ashkenazi Jews, and there's a lot of other ethnic groups. If you go to Children's Hospital, you'll probably always see an Amish person there because there is some sort of child that has some sort of genetic disorder. I believe we're at the foot here, so the foot's kind of backward, that spot. And that genetics far more common among the Amish than in other groups in the United States. Another population bottleneck, here we see the cheetahs. That's why we always move cheetahs around. There's a lot of breeding programs for these. Basically, there was huge genetic diversity. Keep in mind, cheetahs originated in the Americas and moved to Africa. So they kind of went across the land bridge the other way. There was a bottleneck that occurred, reduced the genetic population. I think it was probably environmental at first, but of course hunting has also played a role as well. Those limited numbers of survivors have increased in size, but you only have that small genetic pool contained. And we see that among the sea otters and the elephant seals as well. All right, I'm going to end this notes right here. This is part 1. I'll have to pick it up with part 2 in the next video.